Aloha and good evening, everyone. My name is Heidi Kim. I'm your Parent Relations Liaison here at Mid-Pacific. I'm relatively new to the family. I've been here maybe all of 30 days or so to the maybe 150 of you that I haven't met yet, hello, and I hope to meet all of you very soon. Tonight, we are pleased to feature and have for you a very special speaker named Jonathan Mooney. He's going to talk to us a little bit about learning differences and ADHD and how to reframe this topic into something that's very positive. Jonathan has been here all day long. To all three chapels, he spoke to faculty and staff, and now he's here to speak to you. So we are absolutely delighted that you could join us tonight. This is the third in our Parent Education Speaker Series here at Mid-Pacific. The Speaker Series is a program that's meant to engage and educate and excite our parents around topics of interest. And I could tell, certainly outside and in this room, that there's a lot of interest in this topic. So again, thank you for coming tonight. Before we get started, I just have a few acknowledgments and thank yous. We're happy to have with us here tonight Dr. Colin and Mrs. Sandy Denny and their son Jason, as well as other supporters of Mid-Pacific's Learning Differences program. Thank you to the Dennys and other special guests here for joining us tonight. We also have Mid-Pacific President Dr. Paul Turnbull and High School Principal Tom McManus. Dr. Edna Hussey will be joining us a little bit later, and they'll help us to facilitate the question and answer session. This event was in motion and in planning long before I got here, so I just wanted to thank the board and parent leaders of Na Ohana Pueo, our school's parent organization, as well as the faculty and staff who were involved in coordinating and collaborating on the entire speaker series, as well as tonight's presentation. And finally, I want to say a very big mahalo to Ian Hunt. Now, many of you may know Ian as a PE teacher, a strength and fitness coordinator here at Mid-Pacific. Ian is also a husband to alumna Leah Young Hunt, father to Sage and Giselle in 5th and 1st grade. And Ian was really instrumental in bringing Jonathan here today to talk to our students, like I said, to our faculty and staff, and now to you. It's been a very full and awesome day. Thank you very much to Ian for spearheading this very special experience for us. I hope you all enjoy yourselves tonight, and I'll turn it over to Ian right now to introduce Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you. So recently I've come out of the closet, so to speak. At the last Schools of the Future conference, I shared my experiences with my cognitive differences. And today I shared it with all the students up here in chapel. And so my past, at age 22, right out of college, I was diagnosed with bipolar mood disorder. I spent about a year in and out of hospitals. I've been stable ever since. And then, at age 39, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And I found Jonathan by chance when I was looking just for a perspective on cognitive differences, learning disabilities, and seeing them from a positive light. And I found this wonderful video. And at that point, I thought it would be wonderful if we could bring him down to speak, and it happened. So I'd like to just share an introduction, a more formal one that I wrote. Jonathan Mooney is a rare public intellectual. He is reminiscent of the great orators of our past, an old soul that has revisited the present day. He reminds us of the value that the spoken word has to shift public debate and give rise to new paradigms. He eloquently intertwines the emotional power of the anecdote with the logic and reason of academia. He speaks to the marginalized while inviting those within the margins to listen. He speaks for those of us with invisible differences labeled as disorders, and perhaps most importantly, he speaks to those of us who have only seen our differences as disabling, not as the gifts they have the potential to become. He spoke to me and my son on the night that my wife and I told him his differences had a name. Up until that point, we'd only used the language of difference. Hey son, could you come in here? We wanted to talk to you. He climbed onto our bed and squeezed his way between us. I looked down and smiled. He smiled back up at us. There was an uncomfortably long pause. Neither my wife nor I spoke. His smile disappeared and his eyes moved back and forth between us. Son, you have what doctors refer to as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. He said nothing, and his body stiffened. He pushed so hard against the headboard that his head was now above my shoulder. I will never forget the look on his face and the tears that followed. In between sobs, he managed to get out what was both a question and a statement at the same time. I'm disordered. Later that night, after all of our tears had stopped, we lay in bed. The iPad lit our swollen faces as we watched Jonathan speak. We laughed and smiled, and eventually I saw a sense of peace in my son's eyes as he fell asleep with his head on my chest. So, thank you, Jonathan, for helping us through that moment, and I turn it over to you.
Oh, wow, man. Oh, thank you, brother. It's been an amazing day, man. Thank you. Whew. Sucks to be the guy who has to speak after that. You know, I've been a public speaker for almost 20 years, and there's been no more touching and powerful introduction than what I heard this evening. I ask all of you, in recognition of Ian's courage, but more importantly, in his ability to take a personal issue and do public good with it by being a catalyst for a conversation around learning diversity. I ask you all to give him a huge, big round of applause for that courage. I also ask you to take a moment and recognize your administration here at this phenomenal institution. It's been a day in which the entire campus community has had a chance to have a critical discourse and dialogue, and also to celebrate the issue of learning differences and attentional diversity. And it takes courage to open up in that way and to welcome a stranger in the way that they have to participate in their community. And I've been deeply honored and touched to be a part of it. And I ask you all to give them a round of applause for making tonight happen. Okay, well, with all that said and done, you know, my name is Jonathan Mooney, and I am so honored to be here with you tonight. You know, I just want to get right to it. I was asked to your school community to speak to students, to speak to faculty, and now to participate in your community here to share my personal experience of navigating the world with learning and attentional differences. And for me, navigating that world at first was very difficult. I struggled in school tremendously. I was the kid who had such a hard time sitting still in elementary school that I spent most of the day chilling out with the janitor in the hallway, right? I was the kid in middle school who had such a hard time keeping his mouth shut, you know, always blurting things out, that I grew up on a first name basis with Shirley, the receptionist, in the principal's office. And in high school, I was the kid who had such a hard time with reading, and specifically a torturous time reading out loud, that I spent most of my high school experience hiding in the bathroom to escape reading out loud with tears streaming down my face. I did not learn to read until I was 12 years old. I couldn't read until I was 12. Growing up, I had every label you can imagine. I was labeled the bad kid, I was labeled the dumb kid, and eventually I became the special ed kid. I was diagnosed with a whole bunch of language-based learning disabilities, as they were called at the time, in 4th grade. I was diagnosed with ADHD, which I think we all know stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, in 5th grade. And in 6th grade, I dropped out of school for about a year. That year, when I left school, I struggled with a number of mental health challenges. I struggled with anxiety, I struggled with depression, and I had a plan for suicide. I spent about a year in and out of a variety of different educational settings. I went to alternative schools for a little bit. I was homeschooled for a while. And then if I'm honest with y'all, I went to no school. I was at home trying to rebuild the sense of self, to face down my adolescence and persevere through high school. So when I got to high school, as I'm sure you can imagine, there were a lot of low expectations that surrounded me. You know, I was told by my dad that I would most likely end up a high school dropout. My dad gave me a 50-50 chance of graduating from high school. I was told by a counselor that I would most likely end up flipping burgers for a living. And then I was told by an educator my senior year that I'd most likely end up in jail or incarcerated. So I was asked to your community to share that journey, but more importantly, to share my journey of change and to talk with you all about how I beat those odds and transcended those low expectations. Because it goes without saying that none of those very hopeful prophecies came to pass in my life. Opposed to being a high school dropout, I became a college graduate. I graduated from a university called Brown University, which you may or may not know is an Ivy League university, with an honors degree in, of all things, English literature, all right? Opposed to flipping burgers, you know, I ended up writing books. The first book I wrote at the age of 21 as an undergraduate at Brown. And opposed to being an inmate, you know, I became an advocate. Somebody who has dedicated his entire professional life to making the world a better place for those who live and learn outside the lines. So my job tonight is to talk about that journey of change and transformation. My job this evening is to answer the very valid question that I know is in your mind. The question I'm asked all the time, which is, hey, Jonathan, how'd you do it, right? How could you go from a 6th grade dropout who could not read at 12 years old to an Ivy League English major, published author? What drugs did you take? And where can I buy some, all right? I know that's the question on y'all's mind, and that's the question that I want to answer today. But in answering that question about myself, more importantly, I want to talk about what does it mean to create the social conditions that allow students with neurodiversities to live good lives. What does it mean for us to reframe this experience away from seeing it as a deficit to be fixed to a valuable form of human diversity to be celebrated and included? And when I think about that shift, when I think about that change and transformation, there are 3 things that I want to share with you. Let me jump right into what, from my perspective, is the first component of my journey of change and this larger transformation culturally of how we think about kids like me. You know, my journey of change started when I had people in my life who helped me reframe what or who we call the problem. You know, historically, the problem is inside the kid. You know, I remember when I was diagnosed, right? And think of the connotations of that word diagnosis in and of itself, implying that this is something negative that we're finding out. I remember when the test results from that diagnosis came back, and I and my mom were called into the school psychologist's office, right? The lights were low, there was soothing music, there was tissues on the table. It was obvious that we were at a wake for the death of my normality, right? It was a bad thing. Things were wrong with this kid. The language of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, language processing disorder, something's up with this kid. But the reality is that for me, all of those things that were called disorders were really differences in the truest sense of that word. And what really held me back was the negative self-concept that I developed because of how those differences were treated. Let's use ADHD as a very good example of that. You know, you hang out with that word, doesn't sound like a very cool thing to have, right? But in reality, ADHD is a difference for me. There are good things about this difference, and there are bad things about this difference. I'm not naive about the bad things that come with my brain. I struggle with executive functioning. I struggle with self-regulation, and I struggle with organization. I have explored the feasibility of stapling my car keys to my forehead, okay? I have the attention span of a gnat. Don't let me do your taxes, okay? It is not a good use of my cognitive skill set, right? But you know what goes hand in hand with some of those very real and legitimate and neurobiologically based weaknesses? What goes hand in hand with those are a bunch of strengths and talents that we don't talk enough about. There's good research that shows that folks with this brain are more entrepreneurial than the general population and better problem solvers than the general population. Good research study I came across shows that EMTs, emergency medical professionals, firemen and women, paramedics with ADD are better at their job than so-called normal EMTs. That makes sense, right? Your house is on fire? You want that dude to have ADD, right? Forget paying attention. Come get my cat, right? So it's a difference with strengths and weaknesses, like any difference that becomes a disability by the way it's treated. ADD wasn't my problem, the desk, that was my problem. How in God's name could a school desk be a kid's disability? Well, let me immerse you into my relationship with that desk. For some kids, it's a benign piece of school furniture. For me, it is a form of enhanced interrogation that would make Dick Cheney proud, right? This is first grade, this is second grade, this is eighth grade, this is today. 5 seconds at that desk, the foot starts bouncing, right? 10 seconds at that desk, both feet start bouncing. 15 seconds at that desk, oh, I'm gonna bust out the drums. 15 minutes at the desk, it's all over. I'm the kid trying to take his leg and put it behind his neck. And that kid is shamed because there's a deeply held cultural and institutional norm that the good kid is the compliant kid. And if you ain't the compliant kid, something's wrong with you. I grew up in a pretty old school Irish Catholic household. So every night at the dinner table with my dad, it was, Jonathan, stop it, stop it, stop it, stop it. What is wrong with you? From my dad. And the same sense of shame happened in some of my classrooms. Not all of them, but some of them. I'll never forget, I had a teacher in second grade named Mrs. C. I've had many, many gifted, brilliant teachers that I will celebrate with you tonight. Mrs. C is not one of them, okay? My foot would be bouncing, she would stop class, she would point at me, all the kids would look at me, and she would say at the top of her lungs, Jonathan, what is your problem? If I had a nickel for every time I heard what's your problem in school, I'd be a rich man today. We put the problem in the kid, and I'm not alone with that. You know, let me tell you one of my favorite examples of that. I spent a lot of time in schools. And back in the day, some time ago, I was in Green Bay, Wisconsin, observing third grade classrooms. I walked into this one classroom, and from the front of the room, I could see in the back of the room a set of boxes made out of bookshelves about 3 feet tall. So they had taken these bookshelves, they made a box about this big. And in one of those boxes, I could see a head bouncing up and down. It was one of the third graders in the box jumping. Now that's not a sight that you see all that much. So I turned to the teacher and with all due respect, I said, hey man, what's up with the box, you know? Guy looked at me with a straight face, not a hint of irony, and he said, Jonathan, That's Jack. I said, you have a Jack in the box? Are you kidding me? Put poor little Jack in the back of the room in a box. I don't got to belabor the point. Hey, guess what? ADD ain't Jack's problem. The box is Jack's problem. Difference disabled by the way it's treated. And the same is true with my so-called learning disabilities. You know, I'm not naive about the challenges that come with dyslexia and other language-based learning issues. You know, if you look at a brain scan of somebody with dyslexia, you will see that the left hemisphere, which is the part of the brain responsible for processing language, processes information differently and less effectively than the so-called normal brain. That's real. That's why I struggle with reading and writing. Not that I'm lazy, not that I'm not trying hard enough, not that I'm not smart. It's neurobiological in its nature. And I struggle with those things to this day. I read in the 12th percentile. That means I read like somebody in 7th or 6th grade. I spell at a 3rd grade level today. Those are very real challenges. But do you know what goes hand in hand with those challenges? Just like ADD, bunch of strengths, bunch of gifts that we don't talk enough about. We know that folks with this learning difference are often more creative than the general population. So dyslexia in my life was a difference, you know, not a disability. If I overcame anything, it wasn't dyslexia, it was dysteachia that I overcame. I overcame being made to feel that I was dumb because of my dyslexia. And that belief and self-concept that I was the stupid kid, that's really what held me back. And that self-concept of being the dumb kid, it's got an origin in our institutional practices and norms. Its origin is a deeply held confusion or conflation of being smart and being good at reading. And that's something that we hold deeply in school and beyond. You know, I'm the father of 3, you know, and my oldest boy, you know, he had some challenges with reading when he first started school. You know, give you a sense of his challenges with reading. He came home one day in elementary school and he said, "Hey Dad, what they're having me read is so easy, I can read it with my eyes closed." Like, that ain't reading, son. Now, hey, it's telepathy and you gotta celebrate the strengths, you know? But that is not decoding phonemes, you know? And for a while, he felt that made him dumb because I lived in a community where everybody has a genius on their hands in Santa Monica, California, right? And how do they know they got baby Einstein at home? It's always the reading. You know, I hear things like this: drop off, pick up, play dates. I hear, "Oh, my kid's so smart. They're reading chapter books and they're in 1st grade. Oh, my kid's so smart, they know all their letters and they're in preschool. Oh, my kid's so smart, they know phonics and they're in utero." It's always the reading. I ain't ever hear "my kid's so smart, they're good at building or talking or drawing." A narrow definition of what constitutes intelligence. And that narrow definition of what constitutes intelligence gets institutionalized in the form of the smart group and the stupid group. Who remembers the smart group and the stupid group from their schooling? Anybody? Let me ask that question differently, because the reality is, for better or worse, guess what? Y'all went to a school that had the smart group and the stupid group. They didn't call it that. It's not malicious, don't get me wrong. But who remembers reading groups? Ever hard to tell which reading group is the smart group and which is the stupid group? Not hard to tell, right? You got the blackbirds over here, you got the bluebirds over here, and then over in the annexed trailer building, you got the sparrows. Come on now. Everybody knows which group is the smart group or the stupid group. Let me put it this way. When I was growing up, everybody knew that my group was the dumb group because my group was a bird that did not fly. It was an ostrich and it ran quickly. And I'm chilling out with C-Spot Run, and everybody knows that the condors are the smart group Because they're reading War and Peace. It ain't hard to tell. And the worst thing about it is not only do I know it, but who else knows it? Everybody knows it. Some of the worst memories of my life, going over to the other side of the room, pick up my little book. Let's be honest, See Spot Run, not a bad book, right? Nice narrative structure, nice moral tale, but you don't want to be caught dead with Spot when you are 14 years old, now do you? Spot's going in the backpack, Spot's going in the shirt, because as I walk by all the other kids, I'm going to hear it. Jonathan, go back to your dumb reading group. Go back to your stupid reading group. Go back to your retarded reading group from the other kids. You know, we've all learned to have a narrow definition of what constitutes intelligence. We know what gets you in the smart group ain't your tactile kinesthetic intelligence. It ain't your emotional IQ. It's a narrow band of academic skills. And our task as a community is to broaden that definition of intelligence. You know, intelligence isn't one thing, it's many things. It's not singular, it's multiple. Don't know about y'all, but some of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. They didn't read well, they didn't write well, but they could rebuild that car engine from scratch. And that form of intelligence is just as valuable and important and valid as our traditional definition of academics as smart. But it wasn't dyslexia that held me back. It was feeling stupid. And it wasn't ADHD. It was feeling like I was the crazy or bad kid. It wasn't the difference. It was the way the difference was treated and the self-concept that came from it. And that's good news, because guess what that we need to do as a community? We should spend our energy trying to rebuild and help kids have a different sense of self. And one of the ways that you can do that is help them see a bright future for themselves. You know, I told y'all I dropped out of school when I was in 6th grade. You know, and what helped me at that point, what saved my life when I had that plan for suicide, was a self-concept innovation and intervention. My mom, who was worried about me, was searching for all sorts of things that could help. And she came across an interview that was on Dateline, and she taped it and made me watch it. The interview was with a young man, 23 years old, went to Yale Law School. But the reason this guy was being interviewed by Dateline is that his mom read every one of his law books to him. He couldn't read a word. Do you have any idea the hope that image gave me? Now, let's be honest. Sucks to be the guy's mom, right? I got that. I feel you. I didn't say it was a hopeful image for mom. I said it was a hopeful image for me. I saw an image of a better future. I got the message that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't broken. And y'all can do that. You know, in college, I co-founded this thing called Eye to Eye. Takes adults with learning differences, matches them with younger kids, give them hope for their future. Y'all can do that. You don't got to be a part of Eye to Eye to do so. But as you try to do that, don't bring the famous people in as role models. Doesn't do me any good to hear that Whoopi Goldberg was dyslexic. She was, that's true, she's too far away. Doesn't do me much good to hear that Tom Cruise is dyslexic, or was until Scientology cured him. It's the real person that matters more. It's the local business owner. It's the community college student. It's the University of Hawaii student. It's the senior hanging out with the ninth grader with the third grader. That doesn't cost any money. You're building a network that gives kids the message that different isn't deficient. And that is the first step towards change. But it's not the last. I told you there were 3 things. That was number 1. Now I want to talk about what the second one is. And the second one is really embodied by my mom. So I want to tell you a little bit about her. You know, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Colleen Mooney. So I'll give you a mental image of my mom so you can see her in your mind. You know, my mom was dismissed and taken not very serious in her own life and in her engagement in my education. She was dismissed for a bunch of reasons. On one hand, my mom, not a tall woman, you know. On a good day, in high heels, on her tippy toes, my mom 4'11", right? Little Irish bulldog, you know? So people didn't take her all that seriously. My mom was dismissed because of where she came from. You know, my grandparents, Irish immigrants, you know, worked coal mines in Montana, Went to San Francisco to be domestics cleaning people's homes. That's where my mom came from. My mom struggled in school. She was most likely unidentified as somebody with a learning difference. So she dropped out of high school. She had my brother when she was 17. She had my sister when she was 18. My other sister when she was 19. Found herself a single mom on public assistance. So people looked down upon her for those reasons. And lastly, my mom was dismissed because she had a very funny voice. Very high-pitched, very squeaky voice, like Mickey Mouse, okay? My mom totally sounded like Mickey Mouse. But people dismissed my mom at their own peril. She wasn't tall, she wasn't wealthy, she sounded like Mickey Mouse, but my mother, she cursed like a truck driver. So let me ask you all a question. If you were a principal, if you were a teacher, did you want cursing Mickey Mouse in your office? The answer to that question, if for any reason you are confused, is no, okay? But guess where my mom was when things were going wrong for her son? My mom was in that office. How did we know she was in that office? Because every dog in the neighborhood was running away. Only bats could hear her high-pitched obscenities. Glass was shattering. My mom understood that I didn't need somebody in my life to fix me, which is often the message that parents and caregivers and teachers are given. That your job is to fix this kid's problem. My mom understood that I didn't need somebody to fix me. What I needed was somebody to fight for me. Those are very different things. The idea of being an advocate for a young person, of waking up every day and saying, you know what, as a teacher, because teachers are advocates, as a caregiver, as a grandma, as a grandpa, as a father, as a mother, my job is to make sure this young person's right to be included is protected. And that was the most important shift my mom made and the most important fight that she had. And in being that advocate, what my mom embodied and fought for was not for her kid to change, but for the environment around her kid to change. And in all of the studies, in all of the individual stories, in all of the research literature about what helps young people with differences live good lives, it's always somebody in their corner. It's always a group of people behind them who has agreed to modify the environment and not the kid. In my life, the environment was changed in a number of ways that made a difference for me. Number one, the environment changed to provide me services that I needed. Those are very important. When you read in the 12th percentile, when you struggle with executive functioning, to have access to learning, you need an opportunity for services and support. It's an issue of equity and it's an issue of social justice to make sure that the curriculum is accessible to a diversity of different types of minds. Those services matter and investing in them is important. But that's not enough, and it's not sufficient. Not only did my mom fight for the services, but my mom also fought for my right to be accommodated. Now, accommodating is very different than providing a service. The idea of accommodation is that the environment needs to change and open up to support a young person. You know, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for accommodations. If you look at my academic journey, when I'm accommodated, I did well. When I wasn't, I struggled. There's a 1-to-1 ratio. I'm here today because I had books on tape. That's what it was back in my day. Thing was so big, you had to put it into a backpack and plug it into a generator, right? But it made a difference for me. It allowed me to get content when I couldn't read. I'm here because of dictation, so I could get my ideas out. When kids listen, they learn to read better. When they talk, they learn to write better. Those things matter. I'm here because of time extensions on exams. Small thing that can be pretty contentious sometimes. But if you read in the 12th percentile, and you have the same amount of time as somebody who reads at a so-called typical rate, how is it fair that I don't have more time to access that test? Why does how fast I know something trump how well I know it? Are we trying to educate a generation of Jeopardy contestants, right? Those things matter. I'm here because of accommodations that help me move in the classroom. I had an amazing teacher named Mr. Starkey. Guy put a bunch of clipboards in the back, and he said anyone who needed to get up and pace during class could go and do that. Clipboards cost $5, didn't disrupt anybody. I'm here because I had teachers who said, hey, if you can't sit in that chair, let's get a stress ball. And that's a win-win. I'm not making noise, moving my chair, and I get a sweet ab workout at the same time. Those accommodations give me access to the curriculum. But you know what? Accommodations isn't enough either. Because accommodation as a concept and a word, it has a little bit of a negative connotation. It implies that we are accepting or accommodating something that we don't like that much, right? Let me put it this way. When my mother-in-law comes to visit, I don't celebrate her visit. I don't embrace her visit. I accommodate her visit. So we got to go a step further, and we have to be fighting to build environments that are universally designed. The idea that we can build learning systems that don't just work for some brains, but work for all brains. That's the future of this work, and that helps every single kid with or without a diagnosis thrive in the classroom. It's that commitment to environment change that puts people on a different path. You know, let me give you one of the best examples of that I've ever seen. You know, I'm researching this new book and have been for a while. And in researching this book about neurodiversity, I learned about this very innovative software design company that originated in Finland but is now all over the world, Silicon Valley as well. And what makes this software design company unique is they have an intentional focus on hiring computer engineers with autism or Asperger's. It's not a charity, it's a business. They see value where other people see pathology or sickness, and that makes a lot of sense. Don't know about y'all, but folks with autism and Asperger's have strengths and talents I don't got. You know, they're good systems thinkers, they're good problem solvers, and let's be honest, they're often more productive employees because they don't waste a lot of time on chit-chat, all right? No office cooler banter, let's do some programming, right? So I was intrigued by this environment that saw value where everyone else sees problems. And I went to go visit one of their locations. And I was so inspired to see that it wasn't a fix the person model, it was a change the environment model that unleashed that value. This was a place that had the lights turned down low because a lot of the behavior problems associated with neurodiversity comes from overstimulation in the environment. It was a place of active working where you could stand, you could sit, you could walk, you could do whatever you want to be productive as a human being. It was a place that recognized different work schedules because often human beings are optimal at different times in the day. It was a place that wasn't trying to take the round peg and fit the square hole. It was a place that was all about changing that hole and making it bigger to include more people. It was inspiring and it changed lives. You know, at the end of the day of my trip there, they were very generous and they hosted a cocktail party reception. And I have to tell you, if you haven't been to a cocktail party with 500 computer programmers with Asperger's, you haven't lived, right? You got yourself a new item for your bucket list. It was so much fun. They were so generous. It was so quiet. And at the end of my time at the reception, I joined a group of programmers who were sitting there talking. And the moment I joined their table, the conversation went dead silent. And it was apparent to me that they had just been talking about me. You know, y'all have been there before. You can tell when somebody's talking about you. So I turned to one of the employees and I say, hey man, what were you talking about? And the guy looks at me and says, nothing. Then I know they've been talking about me, right? So I say, no, hey, I'm here to learn from you. You know, I really want to know your opinion and your perspective. And so the guy looks at me, he looks at his colleagues, he looks back at me, and he says, well, we think you're weird. And you know what? In their normal, I was. It was a profound moment of realization for me that normal isn't a fact in the world that we discover. Oh, there it is. It's a construct we create with our actions and with our decisions. And there's good news with that, because we, in the systems that we design, with the choices we make, we can build schools, communities, places of work that include more people, that broaden our definition of what is normal, that reimagine the concept to include different minds and different bodies and help them live a good life as they are. And that matters. Okay, I got one more for you, right? Told you there are three things, you know, in my journey of change, journey and change of others. The idea of building a more positive self-concept, away from the broken kid to somebody with differences that isn't deficient. Then the idea of not fixing the kid, but changing the environment around the kid. And last but not least, my journey of change, the journey of change of every single successful person thriving with a difference that I has met, has been fundamentally about rejecting that deficit model and replacing it with a strength and asset-based approach. You know, if you're a kid like me, you hear so much about what's wrong with you. But when all we do is talk about what's wrong with the kid, we lose sight of what's right with that kid. If you're a kid like me, so much of your day and your time and your weekend and your summer is all about fixing your problem. But when all we do is fix, the message to the kid is, guess what? You're broken. And no human being goes off to live a good life feeling broken. That ain't a recipe for well-being and thriving and living a productive existence in community. We got to flip the script on that. We got to move away from that deficit orientation and reject it. And again, in my life, that was a seminal moment. And for me, it really happened in a few places. First, it happened with educators, and that's really important. I had educators in my life who put aside the deficit model. You know, I had this teacher that I talked about today named Mr. Starkey, right? He was an AP English teacher when I was in high school. He had no business letting me into his AP class at all, right? He was the kind of guy that was looking for interesting thinkers and not people just playing the school game. To get into his class, all you had to do is answer the Zen koan of what is the sound of one hand clapping, right? And if you could do that in an interesting way, he didn't care about your GPA or anything else. You know, he's the kind of deep intellectual that cares about learning is transformation. Big old beard, kind of guy that named his kids after characters in a J.D. Salinger novel, right? That guy, you know him. And this was a guy that let me in, took a risk on me, and he had a ferocious commitment in helping people know what they were good at. That was what he was all about. And he was relentless in his questioning. Hey, what are you good at? What are you good at? What are you good at? And you know what? For a long time, my answer was nothing. But eventually, he came to me, and he said, hey, Jonathan, I've noticed you are good at telling stories. And you could be a writer one day. And I said, you are full of shit, Mr. Starkey. You've been smoking too much weed in the parking lot, man. I can't spell. What are you talking about? The guy looked right at me and he said, hey, Jonathan, screw spelling. Screw spelling, yeah. He went on to paraphrase Mark Twain, and he said, I don't trust a man who can only spell a word one way. He said, hey, you got something about you. Don't lose it and don't give it up. To hear that from a teacher, to flip that script, to move away from what was wrong, to elevating and celebrating what was right, was life-changing on my journey. Now, we can't just talk about it, though, when it comes to strength. We also have to make time for it in the day. You know, we've gotten pretty good at the rhetoric of difference, haven't we? You know, kids come to school in kindergarten and they're told they're all special snowflakes, right? We're all special snowflakes. And then the bell rings and that turns into, now sit your special snowflake ass down. I'll tell you how to learn, when to learn, and where to learn, you special snowflake. Come on now. You can't talk about strength and difference if we don't make time for it. That's one of the things my mom fought the most for, because that relentless focus on remediation was like an industrial complex, you know, sucking me dry for revenue, right? And the ground zero of the fix-it machine in my life was spelling, of course. Every Friday in elementary school was spelling test day. What a wonderful way to end the week, right? And every day leading up to spelling test day was fix-it day. What a wonderful way to spend the week. On Monday, I got my words, and I did 2 hours of flashcards to get those words in. And then on Tuesday, I did 2 hours of drawing the words in the sand. And then on Wednesday, I did 2 hours of building the words with blocks. And then on Thursday, I did 2 hours of interpretive dance to get the words in. And what happened every single Friday? I failed that test. But not this one Friday. Never forget, I came on down to the breakfast table. Usually we did one more flashcard session, but there were no flashcards with the Pop-Tarts that morning. I looked at my mom and I said, "Hey Mom, what's up?" And my mom said, "Jonathan, today we are ditching school and we're going to the zoo." Every Friday for 1 year, because the school would not capitulate on the importance of spelling tests, me and my mom ditched school. She called it Build Your Strength Day. We went to the zoo because I loved animals, and guess what? I learned a lot about natural ecosystems there. We went to the construction site because I was the builder, taking things apart, putting it back together. There I saw that math was relevant. We went to improv class because guess what? In class I was cracking jokes, getting detention, but on the stage I was getting applause. I saw that those strengths mattered. Build your strength day. Make time for it. Don't double down on remediation. Move away from that model and balance it with building strength. I wouldn't be here, frankly, if it wasn't for Build Your Strength Day. You know, I was asked by a reporter some time ago by the USA Today, "Hey, Jonathan, give the youth of America an inspiring message about how you made it to Brown University." And I said, "Well, ditch school." Because if we're real about it, we ain't doing Build Your Strength Day at school now, are we? We're doing Fix Your Problem Day at school. And that's demoralizing for young folks. You know, if I've learned anything from my travels, it's that folks who go off to thrive outside the lines, they have an island of competency. That's what the researchers call it. They got something that they care about, something that they're good at, something that their parents, their teachers protect and nurture that keeps them afloat until they can find the right environment for their life. Protect those islands of competency. Because what we know about human beings and flourishing more than ever is that successful folks don't get good at everything. They get good at something. What do? To mitigate their weaknesses? Well, they do what we all do. They use teams, technology, and help. And they build a life around their assets and their strengths. That's true for me. I followed Mr. Starkey's advice. I write books for a living. I don't spell well at all. How did I do that? Well, guess what? I married my spell checker. It's called strategic mating, and if you haven't tried it, you should try it. Everybody's got something right with them. Everybody's got something that they're interested in that can turn into a strength, and the strength can turn into a passion, and the passion to a purpose, and the purpose to a pathway that leads them to a more successful life as a human being. Okay, I want to conclude. And I want to conclude by coming on back here to what, from my perspective, is the heart of what we are doing for our kids, yes, for students, of course, but ultimately what we're doing for our culture and our society. Because this is a big deal, embracing neurodiversity. Because embracing and celebrating neurodiversity is a rejection of the tyrannical idea that there is a normal mind that we all should have, that looms over everybody, that brings judgment upon other human beings and causes people shame when they don't live up to that myth of normalcy. So I want to end my time with y'all with a quick story about the power of challenging that idea that there's a normal mind that we all should have. And this story comes from something that I mentioned earlier in my talk. This organization called Eye to Eye that I co-founded at Brown University. Eye to Eye is now a national organization with chapters in, almost 40 states. It takes seniors and juniors in high school all the way up to college, and they mentor younger kids to give them hope for their future, help them feel like they're not alone and they're not broken. When we started Eye to Eye, however, there was only 5 of us. Not 5 chapters, 5 Brown students with differences, 5 third graders with differences in a room on the south side of Providence sharing our stories. So we got there, and I'll be frank with you, we had no curriculum, we had no idea what we were doing, we were faking it until we make it, right? So I was paired up with this young man named Robert, and I shared my story with Robert for about, maybe 20 minutes or so. And then I took a break, and I went around to observe the other pairs, because it was my program. I needed to make sure things were going okay. So the first pair that I came up to was quite a sight to see. The third grader being mentored, his name was Philip. And the mentor, a Brown University student, his name was Kent Roberts. Philip, hurting kid, 9 years old, school phobia, which means he hides under his bed in the morning and begs his grandma not to take him to school. He's so terrified of school that he rubs his left eyebrow raw. So when I met him, he had no left eyebrow. So he's a hurting little kid. And then his mentor was and still is a good friend of mine named Kent Roberts. So when I say this, I mean it as a compliment. Kent is a complete freak show, okay? He's got a long beard down to here. He's got long hair down to here. The guy totally looks like Jesus, okay? Get him some Birkenstocks and a staff, and you got JC in the house, right? So they're quite a sight to see. You got hurting Philip and Jesus-looking Kent. And I walk up to the group, and when I get within 3 feet of them, I hear Kent screaming at the top of his lungs at Philip. And you got to remember, Philip is 9 years old. Kent is screaming, Philip, if you learn one thing at Eye to Eye, you have to learn that normal people suck, Philip. They suck. That's not what Jesus says, man. I mean, come on now. I'm a public elementary school. I think the cops are coming next. So I go home that night, and I'm furious. I think Kent has ruined Eye to Eye. You know, there is absolutely no federal funding for an organization whose mission is to curse at children, right? So I call the guy on the phone, and I yell at him for about 10 minutes. Why did you say that? How could you say that? What were you thinking saying that? He doesn't say a word. Until the very end, all he says is, it's true, and hangs up the phone. So I'm thinking, maybe, just maybe, water under the bridge. You know, no principal was present, no teacher was there, right under the rug, right? Wrong. Next morning, I get a call from the principal of the Fox Point Elementary School, Principal Mary Brennan. And I am respectfully summoned to her office to discuss what transpired the day before at Eye to Eye. So I drive to the school, and I'm thinking in my head of all the ways I can apologize for scarring this third grader. And to confirm my fears, when I get to the office, not only is it Principal Mary Brennan, but it's also Philip's grandmother. Because Philip lives full-time with Grandma. And the moment I walk in to the office, Philip's grandmother, she stands up and she points at me and she says, "What did you do to my grandson?" I said, "Nothing, it was that Kent guy." Hey, Jesus or not, right under the grandma bus, you know? I never met him. I don't know him. He appeared out of nowhere. She had tears in her eyes. She said, "For 3 years, my grandson's hid under the bed before school. For 3 years, from our home to school, he's been in tears, turning around, making me go back. But today, the day after eye to eye, my grandson was up early, waiting in the car, ready to go to school." What the hell did you do to my grandson? I looked at her and I said, "Well, it was my good friend, Kent Roberts." And you know what? It wasn't me. It was Kent. For the first time in Philip's life, he heard, "You're not broken." And that changed who he thought he could become. You know, that's the experience when you're told you're not normal. You're told that you are not a valuable human being as you are. That you are broken and need to change to be accepted and celebrated and loved and included as a human being. And challenging that arbitrary line of what is and what is not normal is the heart of this work together as a community. Because that idea of normalcy is a tyrannical idea. It's an idea that has robbed many people of their ability to be themselves and accept who they are for who they are as they are. And it is a myth, as Kent said. When you think about the idea of normal, it's like the horizon. You think you're getting closer to it. It just gets further and further away from you. You know, if I've learned one thing in my life, it's the only normal people are people you don't know very well. Because the moment you get to know another human being, it's their eccentricities, it's their differences, it's their fallibilities, it's their weaknesses, it's their strength that constitutes their humanity. Difference is paradoxically normal. And what we are doing as a community, as individuals, as a movement, we are out there fighting for every single human being's right to be different. Thank you all so very much. Quite a pleasure to be here. So appreciate it. Right on. Thank you. Oh, thank you. That's cool. Okay, thank you all so much. Really appreciate your time and energy. I'd like to switch gears now from talking at you to talking together a little bit. We got, about 30 minutes or so for some dialogue as a group, and then I'll hang out a little bit afterwards if you want to come and say hello. But right now, let's open the floor. I know that they're running mics. If you don't want to wait for one, don't worry about it. It's an okay room. I can reiterate questions, and we'll go from there. So what's on your minds? Thoughts, questions? Raise a hand, and we'll kick off Q&A. Please, up front.
I just want to say thank you very, very much. My son attends Assets. Thank you, Mid-Pack. Thank you so much. My son's 17. He goes to Assets. And you may very well be the charismatic adult in his life that has impacted him. He came home and couldn't wait to tell us that we had to come tonight. And I said, "Yeah, no, I made a reservation. He said, "No, you really have to go." So you impacted my son at Assets, and I believe we found a school that is trying to do what you're talking about. And I'm so very, very grateful. And you've given us even more hope by being here tonight. So I just really want to say thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. That touches my heart, and I appreciate it immensely. And I'd like to use your comment and your celebration of my sharing of my story as a challenge to others. because I do know that one of the ways that we change culture around this issue is to use the word that Ian used in his eloquent introduction, to kind of come on out of the closet and to share our experiences of this with others. Because, we ain't 6 degrees of separation from this. We're not 3 degrees. We're not 2. Every human being is 1 degree separations from an issue like this. It impacts so many people's families. And the more that we are honest about those experiences and have the courage to voice those, the more that folks don't feel alone. So I thank you for recognizing that for me and what it meant for your son. And I challenge and encourage all of us to voice our experiences of neurodiversity, to share those with loved ones and colleagues and others, because it builds a more inclusive culture and ultimately a more inclusive world. So thank you for that. Other thoughts, questions, comments? In the back, please.
Hi there. I'm really grateful for what you did today at school at Midcap and made a difference to our son and to a bunch of his friends. And I think it's really wonderful that you're talking to the children. How much time are you spending talking to the educators and the administrators? And when we're talking about a culture change, the kids can't make the culture change without the school and the institution. I think the fact that you're here is a really great sign.
Yeah.
But I also want to know what the school is now going to do with this whole paradigm shift that you're proposing, because I think it's really important that our educators and our administrators understand it as well.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And your name?
Lisa Grove.
Lisa, thank you for your passionate question and comment. And let me reiterate it again for folks in the room. Very specific question about how often am I talking to systems leadership, for lack of a better word, and what are the due difference that come from that? Because rightfully so, a core foundational principle of what I articulated tonight was not change the kid, but change the context. And young folks have limited to no control over the changing of the context, and that requires leadership from elsewhere. So let me use my trip to Hawaii as an example, because I think it is a good microcosm of what I'm doing more broadly. So yesterday, I had an opportunity to speak to students at the Asset School, and that was facilitated in part by this institution here, as well as by the Hawaii Independent School Association. So I thank them for their opportunity and their time. We then spent 3 hours with a group of almost 50 educators in an intensive workshop from multiple schools across the area, really looking at due difference that bring these principles to life. And I left very inspired by the vision, the authentic commitment of those educators to these ideas. And then again today, not only did I have an opportunity here to speak with essentially 5th through 12th grade in multiple different settings, but I also spent a good hour and 15 minutes plus, when you include 2 sessions, almost 2, with faculty and educators here. And one of the things that I left so inspired by was a acknowledgement of work to be done. No one is claiming that we've solved this problem, but an authentic and deeply held commitment to wrestle with the work to be done, and to be building a culture that kind of moves at 3 fronts, which is the service front that I talked about, the accommodation front that I mentioned, but also at the same time starting to think and talk about what are some universal design of learning that helps all kids. I had an amazing conversation with a gentleman that sat right there in the back row at the faculty seminar today, in which he talked about the active learning environment in his classroom, ranging from those stress balls to those exercise balls to get up, and I left inspired by that. But there is more to do. There's more to do in every school in the nation, in public and private schools everywhere. And in my travels, I find that we are at an inflection point when it comes to these issues. We have, I think, a generation of educators who have been acculturated to the idea of diversity and neurodiversity. I'm very inspired by that. But we have a set of antiquated systems that have yet to really change, to fully enable those educators to live those principles. And that systems change is slow. It's hampered by top-down bureaucracy in public school settings in which bureaucrats are imposing what happens in schools. And that's something that we have to take very seriously. But it's happening. and I'm leaving inspired by that. And you know what? It is a push-pull in the sense of where change comes from. You know, change comes from top down, it comes from bottom up, it comes from the side where parents are demanding from schools and where students are articulating their needs. It's a full, multiple front effort, and I think my time here has embodied that there's a number of institutions ready to tackle that challenge. So I appreciate it. Right on. What else we got? What else we got? Yeah, right up front, please.
So thank you for bringing out the awareness. For me, it was just awareness. And so what would you recommend to me as next steps? Like, I'm just a parent. So if my child is different, then what is my next steps? What should I be doing to get more educated, more in tune with this, change my interaction with my children?
Yeah. And your name?
Eric.
Eric. And Eric, I appreciate your question. I appreciate your openness and your desire to be on a path that helps your son or your daughter. That touches me as a father of three. So I appreciate that. And so Eric asked me, hey, what are next steps? Let's be concrete about this, And I would say there is a little bit of a punch list, Number one, I would say, how has your family been talking about the issues of learning or attentional differences? Maybe there hasn't been conversation about it. Maybe it's been really driven by the assessment that came, and so the conversation is a little bit on the negative side because it's focusing on the problems that emerged. So I would ask yourself, where are you at with that experience of talking and naming this? And I would encourage you, wherever you are on the journey, to be moving towards a conversation that essentially says that whatever information we got, the so-called diagnosis, is really an assessment of strengths and weaknesses. And every human brain has strengths and weaknesses. If I did an assessment of this group, there would be no one person that was all good, Seeing how you're at a learning difference talk, I can say it's probably a little bit like me, because the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. Y'all know that, right? So look around a little bit, So I would encourage you to think about where you are in talking about this. I would use neutral language. I would use language of strength and challenges. I would use language of difference and the idea that there are a lot of positives that come not despite the challenges but because of them. So I would start there with your language. Next, I would think about your time. And I would there's an exercise called the time journal, when you actually look down and you look at how much time you're spending. And what I would be trying to understand is, where are you on the balance between fix-it time and tutor the strength time and the islands of competency time, right? And you want to get those things balanced, or even better, you want to make sure you're doing more of the building of the strength than you are of the fixing of the problem. And I would encourage you to think about and have a dialogue with the educational team that's there to support your child about how much time in their school day is being spent on strength versus remediation, because that matters tremendously. And then the third thing, and I want to tell a quick story about this. The third thing I'm going to pull from my dad and tell you about my dad for a minute, because me and my dad, hey, rocky road, grew up me thinking my dad was ashamed of me, and I learned too late in my life that my father wasn't ashamed of me. He really was sort of ashamed of himself, and he had a lot of the experiences that I had without any of the knowledge and without any of the support growing up in an Irish Catholic household, in a Catholic school, where my dad literally, and this is not a joke, had a nun named Sister Payne, okay? The Lord had put her in her profession, right? Like that's my dad, that's where he grew up. And so, the guy made a lot of mistakes. But he did one thing right. I'll tell you about this one thing. You know, I had a lot of ups and downs. You like to think that your journey is all a straight line. And one of the things when I went through that very difficult year when I left school that made a difference was my mom and that image of hope. But another thing was something my dad did. You know, I kind of left school in 1988. And 1988 was the very famous World Series between the Dodgers and the A's, if there's any baseball fans in the house. This guy, Kirk Gibson, hit a walk-off home run with 2 outs, right? I was at that game. But you know what? I don't remember being at that game. You know what I remember? I remember after the game, me and my dad were sitting in the parking lot, and we were waiting for the traffic to go away. And I was having a really hard time in school, and I had just left school. And I was expecting my dad to turn to me and give me a lecture and say, hey, Jonathan, buck up and work harder. Why are you lazy? What's wrong with you? My dad turned to me and he said, son, I love you as you are. And I'm here today because of that. And all the things he did wrong, he did that right. And that matters. So for anybody, as we think about, getting on the right path, as we think about getting in the right space in our relationship, it is to pull all the clutter away, to prioritize what matters, which is the well-being of somebody you care for, and to tell them that they're okay as they are, you love them unequivocally. That matters. I appreciate the question, man. Right on. What else we got? Way in the back. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's a good question. And what's your name? Joan. So Joan asked me, how did I get through Brown with my reading challenges? She was too polite to ask what I know was in your mind, Joan, which is how the hell did you get into Brown in the first place? It's cool, Joan. I got it. Let's do this. Let me answer both the asked and the unasked question at the same time. I want to talk about my journey to Brown a little bit, because obviously it's a big leap from struggling in 6th grade and kind of muddling the way through high school to Brown. So let me spend a little more time kind of fleshing that out a little bit. My high school experience was very much, as I mentioned, a story of thriving when accommodated and floundering when not. And you see that in the transcripts of many kids. And it comes across as, well, what's going on? You did so good over here, but why not here? You must be lazy there. We tend to think that it's a kid problem when the variance is often an environment variance, right? So I kind of made it through, held on with the island of competency of athletics and soccer, which is a big deal for me. And I want to make a quick note about that. I mentioned in my talk about the need to preserve those islands of competency and to invest in them with our time. But there's often a number of actions and policies that get in the way of that. I mentioned the temptation sometimes to double down on fix it, right? I would have been really good at debate camp, right? But I didn't get to go to debate camp. I went to phonics camp instead, right? Where do we put our time? But there's also institutional school policies. Let's look at the policy as if you fall under a 2.0, you can't play sports. Well, guess what? For a bunch of kids, the moment that they lose sports, guess what? They're out entirely. You've lost them in their entire education, right? So I had a number of folks who preserved that island of competency, who accommodated, and more importantly, I had a number of voices in my life who said to me, Jonathan, survive school and thrive in life. And that's a really important message, I had this Irish grandma right off the boat, and she used to say to me, hey, Jonathan, difficult children make interesting adults. And she's right about that. Hey, more Fortune 500 companies are run by C students than valedictorians. That's just a statistical fact. So my mom and others said, hey, get through it. You don't got to be perfect. this isn't a reflection on you. Just get through it, survive it. Because often, paradoxically, higher education and beyond can be better for kids with neurodiversities. And I found that to be true. So when I got to my first university on athletic scholarship, got in, I would say, mostly, if not entirely, because of athletics. When I got there, I had a renaissance in my education. And that renaissance came from a few things. It came from, one, being fully accommodated for the first time. It was 1995, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which mandated accommodations in public and private settings if they took $1 of federal funds, was in full effect. And I was in a university that was providing those accommodations. Number two, I was in a place where I could choose. So many young people like me are intrinsically motivated. That means they're motivated and can focus when they choose something and they're excited about it. And that's often higher education for young folks. And number three, I hit my neurological stride. You know, we've had a renaissance in understanding the brains of the neurodiverse. And it has proven, the research about our brains, that many of us are late bloomers. You know, my mom used to read to me a book called Leo the Late Bloomer when I was a kid. Anybody know it? Yeah, love it. It's a children's book. It's about a lion that can't do things, blooms later in life. My mom read that book to me until I was 18, okay? You're going to hit your stride. And guess what? My mom has been proved right by a research study from McGill University National Institute of Health, and I quote from it, ADHD is not a deficit, it's a maturation delay. It's a late blooming brain. So that's a perfect storm, right? I get into college, I'm choosing, I'm accommodated, and I hit that neurological stride, and I have a renaissance in my experience of learning. And I do very well at LMU academically, but only taking things that I care about. And then I decide to transfer, and the best kept secret in the world is when you transfer from a 2-year college to a 4-year college, doesn't matter whether it's to the University of Hawaii or Harvard, guess what they don't look at anymore? High school grades and SAT scores. You get yourself a do-over, right? Now, let's be real, you got to do well at whatever institution you're at, but there's a chance for you to do it differently. And that's how I made it to Brown. Now let's talk about how I made it through Brown. And Brown is the case study for the impact of environment around a young person's success. You know, if I would have went to any quote-unquote peer institution, if I would have went to Columbia, would have went to Harvard, very different story. Because those institutions have the strictest core requirements out of any institutions in the country. Brown, on the other hand, has 0 core requirements. You are not told what to take at all until you declare a major. And then you select a major that you care about. In addition to that, Brown has the ability to do independent studies. I took 3/4 of my courses at Brown independent study, in which I integrated my real-world projects. I was writing a book under contract by Simon & Schuster, and I was developing a nonprofit organization, and Brown saw those as valuable for learning. Most other places would have said, forget that, come take calculus, you know? But this was a place that said, your projects matter. So I got to do courses around my projects. I'm living the dream, right? The environment enabled when many environments would have disabled me. And that's a challenge for all of us to make sure that we're matching the neuro profile with the environment that kids go into when they start to launch their life. Don't pick the best college, pick the right college. Those are very different things now, aren't they? And that was an important thing in my journey through Brown. Now, when it came to the very practical question that you asked, you know, how did I manage a Brown University English literature, which is something I care deeply about? You know, I did it in a few ways. You know, one, it was a place that was deeply accommodating for all students without labels or with labels. You know, if you were a Brown student and you came up and you could negotiate reading 5 books instead of 20, but those books would be longer, no problem. If you were a student, didn't matter your label, and you wanted to do all your exams orally, no problem. You wanted to do a portfolio of assessment. You wanted to do a video and a debate and a project, no problem. This was a place that had a radical idea of people can show competency in many, many different ways. And so I worked with faculty to navigate the workload based on my needs. I did a lot of books on tape. At the time, my girlfriend, who became my wife and mother of my 3 kids, she would spell check things, she would read books to me. You know, I did it all. I deployed everything that I had to do. And let's be real about this real quick. If somebody put in an hour, I put in 10. If somebody put in 2, I put in 20. But I was doing it in service of my vision, my sense of what I wanted out of my education. And so it wasn't work or drudgery, it was something that was uplifting and something that was inspiring for me. So how did Brown get to that culture of inclusion? Because I think it's really an important lesson for us. You know, when a lot of stuff gets top-down mandated, the folks on the front lines resent it and don't move forward with it. Brown had a different approach. A wonderful mentor of mine, a guy named Dean Shaw, subsequently retired, but he was there for a long time, and when I was there, he had a different vision than mandating. What he decided to do when the ADA came out and accommodations became the law, what he decided to do was take a group of students with cognitive and physical differences, have that group of students go around to all the academic departments and share their stories, and build a sense of humanizing this issue. Because we discriminate against abstractions. We have empathy for people. And so that sharing of stories, as I mentioned before, as Ian embodied when he came up here today, that matters. It's a path to building empathy, to building a more inclusive and authentically opposed to mandated culture of accommodation and modification. And that's what I found at Brown. Okay, we've got time for one more before we call it a day. Right in the middle, please.
Do you use ADHD medication on your journey? And if so, for how long? And in your research in neurological development, how does that medication play in our child's development?
Yeah, great question. And we may have time for one more if I can be concise. And what's your name? Leanne. Appreciate the question, Leanne. Let's talk about meds. You know, let me start with my personal experience. You know, I was prescribed medication often in my journey. Most recently, yesterday. You know, but it was not a tool that my parents decided to use. And it was not a tool, though after very, very deep, serious consideration, that I decided to use in my sort of autonomous time when it was my choice. My parents decided for many different reasons, as I'm sure many of you all know, not to pursue that. And it was very new at the time. I was really the sort of cusp of what folks call the Ritalin generation. This was the sort of Wild West of it. And then when it was my time to decide, I really came to the conclusion that I could find an environment that did not require that as a tool, both academically and then professionally. I wasn't against it if it was necessary, but I wanted to give that sort of ecosystem niche matching the first go. And subsequently, I think I was successful in that, of finding an academic institution and then a professional path that didn't require it for me. Now, if I would have decided to become an accountant, you know, like, yeah, we probably would have needed that tool, or I would have ended up in jail, right? So for me, that brings me to a very pragmatic place with medication. You know, I think there are some facts that are important for us to share. One is, medication is overprescribed in this country. There is a powerful industry that has a financial incentive to make sure more people use their product. That's true, The other fact that we should be on the same page about is that there are a whole bunch of other things that have the same statistical efficacy as medication in macro level regression analysis. And I'll share those with you. And these things should be considered first and then also in tandem. Number one, we know that diet matters. That's something that we know around refined sugars and things along those lines. Number two, we know that exercise matters a lot. That the activeness, both outside of school, but perhaps more importantly, how active is the learning environment, that those matter. There's a great book for the research around that by a mentor of mine. His name is John Rady. The book is called Spark, and that's a really important book to check out that documents the impact of exercise on a number of neurodiversities and mental health challenges. And the third thing that we know is that mindfulness and meditation have a tremendous impact on the ability to improve self-regulation of emotion and behavior. So those are all research-based things to pursue. The third thing that we know is that it's a two-way street, as was mentioned in one of our comments earlier. The environment needs to change for a kid. And one of the concerns I have with the use of medication is that it's all about fixing the kid and we don't talk about the environment at all. Let me give you a great example of that. There was for a while an ad for ADHD medication in a popular parent magazine. And the ad had ADHD in big bold letters. And then it said, "Almost done with my homework, Dad." Essentially implying that we should be using powerful psychotropic drugs to have kids do their homework. How about let's not have kids have so much damn homework, right? So again, it's that two-way street, right? It's got to be a set of environmental changes. But when you go through that whole list, when you go through the diet, the exercise, the mindfulness, and the environment change, and you still find yourself in a place where it's an effective tool, there's no shame in using that tool. There's no shame in using that tool strategically in a short-term way. There's no shame in using that tool to manage an environment until the environment changes or you move on. And as long as we're mindful, and this is where I think we are in unknown territory, as long as we're mindful of the combination of medication, which does concern me, because that for children, when something like a stimulant for behavior is prescribed, it's been tested by the FDA in isolation, not in tandem with another medication. And we are in uncharted waters when it comes to long-term effects. We got to be real about that when it comes to the cocktails of medication. But as long as we're mindful of that, we are, when it comes to certain medications, there's long-term longitudinal studies that there are limited negative long-term side effects. And so that's how I think of it. I think of it as a tool that helps folks manage an environment. There's other tools. We should use all of them. But if it's a tool that helps, there's no shame in doing so. Okay. Let me give you all my email address, okay? I would love to hear from you. I'd love to continue this conversation. My email address is pretty simple. I'll pause for a second, let people get some things out to write. And while I pause, I will thank you all for your time, and I'll thank my generous host for being here. So I'd love to continue the conversation. My email address is my name. It's one word. It's Jonathan Mooney. It's JONATHAN MOONEY. It's at me.com. Jonathan Mooney me.com. I'd love to hear from you, your loved one, your child. Please share it far and wide. Come say hello to me on Facebook, just Jonathan Mooney on Facebook. My thanks again to this fine institution that left me inspired by their courage to have an honest conversation and all the work they're doing to help kids like me. And last but not least, 2 days, 8 presentations. We're talking about over 2,000 people, all because of Ian sending me an email out of the blue and me impulsively saying, I'll come. So give him a round of applause. Okay, everybody, good night.
That was awesome.
Oh, right on, brother. Thank you for coming out, man, afterwards. I really appreciate it.
I really liked what you said.
Right on, man. What's your name?
Sean.
Sean, dude. Love it. Thank you for coming on.